A notorious police officer infamous for his racist attitude, arrogance, and ruthless schemes brazenly orchestrated a malicious plot to ruin the life of a courageous black woman who dared to challenge the corrupt system. This officer, Peter Rogers, deliberately discovered a bag of money planted in the meeting room, a meticulously fabricated piece of evidence designed to destroy her reputation. But what he didn't anticipate was that the woman was prepared to strike back with unyielding force. When the truth came to light, the shockwave didn't just bring down the mastermind, it tore apart the entire rotten network of power within the police department. This wasn't merely a clash of wills, it was a declaration of war against deeply entrenched injustices. Peter Rogers stood beside his patrol car, his cold expression matching the rigid authority he exuded. His right hand hovered near the gun on his hip, a deliberate show of power. He signaled for a sleek black SUV to stop, the car's slow approach along the quiet street drawing his suspicion. "Step out of the car immediately, ma'am," Peter barked, his tone laced with condescension as he sought to assert his dominance. Inside the SUV, Grace Williams, a petite black woman with neatly tied back hair, sat composed. Her eyes revealed intelligence and determination as she calmly met his demand. "And why should I do that?" she asked, her voice steady and measured, deflecting his authority with ease. Peter's suspicion only deepened as he scrutinized her. "The license and registration don't match this vehicle," he declared. "This car looks too nice to belong to you. It seems stolen." Grace sighed, her composure unwavering. Slowly, she reached into the pocket of her blazer and retrieved a wallet. "I think you should be careful with your tone," she said, producing a gleaming badge that caught the sunlight. "I'm Grace Williams, Chief of Internal Affairs. And you, Officer Rogers, are making a very serious mistake." Peter's face drained of color, and his hand trembled as he instinctively took a step back. The air of confidence he had projected moments ago evaporated. "Wait, who are you?" he stammered, his voice faltering. Grace's gaze bore into him, her voice now icy. "You just racially profiled me, didn't you?" Before Peter could respond, another patrol car pulled up. Sergeant Mark Sullivan, a middle-aged man with a stern face, stepped out, his demeanor shifting as he recognized Grace. "Chief Williams," he greeted, his tone cautious. "What's going on here?" Grace turned her sharp gaze toward Mark, then back to Peter. "Your officer here assumed I wasn't worthy of driving this car," she said coldly. "He thinks it's stolen because the driver happens to be me." Mark's brow furrowed briefly before he regained his composure. Turning to Peter, he said firmly, "That's enough, Rogers. Get back in your car." Peter hesitated, his mouth opening as though to protest, but the weight of Mark's authority silenced him. With a lowered head, he retreated to his patrol car. Mark turned back to Grace, his tone apologetic. "I'm sorry about this, Chief Williams. I'll handle the matter immediately." Grace's arms crossed, her expression unyielding. "You'd better, Sergeant Sullivan. And don't think for a second that I'll let this slide." With that, she returned to her sub and drove away, leaving Mark standing by his patrol car, his heavy sigh barely audible over the hum of the engine. This incident, Grace knew, was merely the tip of a much larger iceberg. Back at her office, Grace sat at her desk, her mind restless as she processed the encounter. The Internal Affairs badge resting on the desk gleamed under the lamp's light, a constant reminder of the responsibility she bore. Opening her laptop, she accessed the internal database, intent on digging deeper into Peter Rogers' record. Peter's file appeared on her screen, and the contents immediately raised red flags. Under the sections for disciplinary actions and complaints, Grace noticed a pattern of reports dismissed for insufficient evidence, or marked as handled internally. She scrolled through the cases. A black man assaulted during a traffic stop, a Latina woman threatened with force during a warrantless home search, a black teenager arrested for resisting arrest, with no evidence beyond Peter's testimony. The pattern was unmistakable. More troubling was the name that appeared repeatedly as the lead investigator in these cases, Sergeant Mark Sullivan. The same man who had tried to smooth over Peter's misconduct earlier now emerged as a central figure in shielding him from accountability. Grace picked up her phone and called Sophia Martinez, a trusted colleague in internal affairs. Sophia's sharp intelligence and unwavering determination had been invaluable to Grace in the past. "Sophia, I need you to pull internal records on Mark Sullivan," Grace said without preamble. Sophia's voice on the other end was measured but carried an edge of bitterness. You know I hate this, right? People like Mark are the reason my family was ruined. Grace's brows furrowed. What do you mean? Sophia hesitated before speaking, her voice cold. My father used to be an officer. He was forced to take the fall for a corruption case he had nothing to do with. The person behind it all. It was the very network you're investigating. The revelation gave Grace pause. I'm sorry, Sophia, but we won't let this happen again. Her determination renewed, Grace delved deeper into the files, uncovering email exchanges that pointed to a coordinated effort to protect officers like Peter. One email, from Mark Sullivan to Internal Affairs, dismissed a complaint with curt authority. The matter has been resolved. No further investigation is necessary. Rogers is a trustworthy officer. The word, trustworthy, grated on Grace, its hypocrisy glaring. It was clear that Peter wasn't merely a rogue officer, he was part of a system meticulously designed to cover up misconduct. And at the center of this web was Mark Sullivan. Determined to uncover the full extent of the corruption, Grace began reaching out to victims whose complaints had been dismissed. One name stood out. Marcus Kane, a young black man who had filed a complaint against Peter 3 years ago. Marcus's account detailed a violent arrest for no discernible reason. His case, like so many others, had been dismissed due to lack of evidence. Grace knew she needed to hear his story firsthand. As Grace continued her investigation, she couldn't shake the feeling that Mark's reach extended further than she initially thought. If Mark is covering everything up, she wondered aloud, then who's covering for him? The question lingered, propelling her deeper into the labyrinth of deception. Peter Rogers stood in the pale light of the street lamp, his face tight with irritation as he noticed Grace Williams approaching. He tried to compose himself, but his words were sharp. What are you doing here? The real question is, what are you doing? Grace replied, her voice cutting through the tension as she stopped in front of him. Her eyes darted to the group of teens, all of whom looked uneasy under Peter's scrutiny. Another group of kids of color, another baseless accusation. Peter's jaw clenched. This isn't your jurisdiction, he snapped, attempting to reassert his authority. I'm handling a disturbance. Grace folded her arms and tilted her head. Since when is playing basketball a crime? She gestured to the teens. What I see is a group of kids having fun. What's the problem here, Peter? Peter pointed to a boy wearing a red hoodie. That one was blasting music and being disrespectful. Grace turned to the teens. Her tone softened as she addressed them. What's your name? Marcus, the boy said hesitantly, glancing at Peter before looking back at Grace. His posture was tense, but his voice was steady. Marcus Kane. Marcus, did you do anything wrong? Grace asked, her gaze steady and unwavering. Marcus shook his head firmly. No, ma'am. We were just playing basketball. He came over and started yelling. Grace looked at the other kids, her voice encouraging. Is that true? The group nodded vigorously, their voices overlapping as they said, yes. Grace turned back to Peter. Well, Peter, any witnesses? Any actual complaints? Peter hesitated, his gaze shifting uncomfortably. Maybe the complainant left, he mumbled, avoiding eye contact. How convenient, Grace replied, her voice dripping with sarcasm. No witnesses, no evidence, yet you're here intimidating children. Is this how you uphold the law? Peter's face flushed with embarrassment and frustration. I'm just doing my job, he muttered defensively. Grace took a step closer, her voice low and firm. Your job is to serve and protect, not harass and intimidate. She turned back to the teens and offered them a reassuring smile. You're all fine. Go back to your game. Nobody's going to bother you. The kids murmured their thanks and quickly returned to the basketball court. Peter stood frozen, his authority diminished. Grace leaned in slightly, her tone sharp. I warned you. You're not just being investigated, you're digging your own grave. Peter's eyes darkened with fury. You'll regret this, Grace, he hissed through clenched teeth. Grace met his glare with unwavering determination. Try me. I'm ready. She walked away, leaving Peter stewing in his frustration. Deep down, Grace knew this was far from over. She could feel the storm brewing, but she was ready for the fight. The next morning, Grace entered her office with a renewed sense of purpose. The confrontation with Peter weighed on her, but it also fueled her determination. She knew she had rattled the cage, and the pushback would be fierce. As she settled into her chair, an unexpected email caught her attention. The subject line read, "Be careful." The content was brief but unsettling. "You're digging into things you shouldn't. People don't like that. Don't make yourself a target." Grace's lips pressed into a thin line. The anonymous warning was meant to intimidate her, but it only steeled her resolve. She suspected the message was linked to her investigation into Sergeant Mark Sullivan and his network of corruption. Later that day, Grace's phone rang. Paul Harris, a colleague from Internal Affairs, was on the other end. His tone was uncharacteristically guarded. "Grace, I've been hearing things." "What kind of things?" she asked, keeping her voice calm. "Rumors," Paul said hesitantly. "That you're going after Sullivan for personal reasons. People are saying you're abusing your position." Grace let out a slow breath, steadying herself. "Paul, you know me better than that. This isn't personal. It's about integrity and justice." "I know," Paul replied, his tone softening slightly. "But not everyone sees it that way. Just be careful." Grace hung up and leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. The smear campaign against her was gaining momentum. Someone was working hard to discredit her, and she had a good idea who was behind it. That evening, Grace met with Sophia Martinez, her most trusted colleague. Sophia's face was tense as she placed a folder on Grace's desk. "I've been digging," Sophia said quietly. "And I found something you need to see." Grace opened the folder and scanned the documents. What she saw made her stomach churn. The papers detailed financial transactions linking Linda Parker, a veteran investigator Grace had trusted, to a charity fund tied to Richard Davenport, a wealthy businessman with deep ties to the police department. "Linda's compromised," Sophia said, her voice filled with disappointment. "She's been taking money from Davenport's fund." Grace's heart sank. "I can't believe it," she murmured. "Linda's always been loyal." "Loyalty doesn't pay the bills," Sophia replied bitterly. "And Davenport's money can buy a lot of loyalty." Grace's mind raced as she tried to process the betrayal. "If Linda's involved, we need to be even more careful. This network runs deeper than we thought." The next morning, Grace walked into the office to an atmosphere thick with tension. Colleagues avoided her gaze, and the air buzzed with whispered conversations. It was clear the smear campaign was working. During a team meeting, Linda Parker openly challenged her. "Grace, I've heard you're digging into Sullivan's cases. Is this about justice, or is it personal?" Grace met Linda's gaze, her voice steady but firm. "What I'm doing is based on evidence and duty. If someone feels threatened by the truth, that's their problem, not mine." Linda smirked but said nothing more. The meeting continued, but the tension was palpable. Grace could feel the walls closing in around her, but she refused to back down. That evening, an anonymous article appeared online, accusing Grace of misconduct. The baseless allegations suggested she was abusing her power for personal gain. Grace knew it was another attempt to undermine her credibility, but she refused to let it break her. She worked late into the night, piecing together the evidence she needed to take down Sullivan and his network. She knew the battle ahead would be brutal, but she was determined to see it through. The truth was worth fighting for, no matter the cost. As the clock ticked past midnight, Grace's phone buzzed with a message from Sophia. "I found something big. Meet me first thing tomorrow." Grace's heart raced. The pieces were falling into place, and she was ready to take the next step. The fight for justice was far from over, but she was prepared to face whatever came her way. Businessman accused of bribing several officers to oversee illegal activities. At the time, Mark, then the captain of a special task force, was assigned to lead the investigation. Strangely, however, the case quickly faded away, and no one was ever charged. Digging further, Grace found an anonymous whistleblower letter sent to Internal Affairs at the time. The letter, written by a former officer from Mark's team, alleged that Mark had accepted a substantial bribe to halt the investigation in exchange for political backing from influential figures. From that point onward, Grace noticed a shift in Mark's trajectory. He gained a reputation as the fixer for complaints, and cases of police misconduct often ended with Mark closing them due to insufficient evidence, or deeming them not severe enough to warrant disciplinary action. Officers like Peter Rogers seemed to enjoy special protection under Mark. Emails and reports Grace uncovered made it clear that Mark had actively falsified or manipulated internal records to shield them. One particular email between Mark and a local businessman revealed a dangerous agreement. The businessman would fund community programs under the police department's name in exchange for investigations into his activities being ignored. What troubled Grace most was the question of how someone once lauded for integrity could fall so far. Through the documents, she discovered that Mark had faced a major financial crisis. His wife had been diagnosed with a severe illness, and the mounting medical bills had placed an unbearable strain on the family. In a personal letter archived in his file, Mark wrote that he had no choice but to accept the offer to save his family. But after taking that first step, it seemed Mark was drawn deeper into the web of corruption. Once he had taken the money, he couldn't escape the grip of those who now controlled him. What began as a desperate decision had transformed him into a key player in the system of cover-ups and corruption. After finishing the files, Grace set them down on her desk, conflicted. Mark Sullivan wasn't a simple villain. He was a tragic example of how a rotten system could corrupt even the most principled individuals. Yet, despite understanding his motivations, Grace knew Mark had to be held accountable. Sympathy couldn't be allowed to weaken her resolve. Grace thought to herself, this system turned him into what he is today, but I won't let it destroy anyone else. With the evidence in hand, she began crafting a plan to expose Mark, not just as an individual but as a critical cog in the machinery of corruption that plagued the police department. Grace sat in her office, the evidence she had gathered on Mark Sullivan and Peter Rogers now sufficient to paint a comprehensive picture of the rot within the system. She prepared a detailed report to send to her superiors, unaware that her actions were no longer taking place in the shadows. A few days later, just as Grace believed she had enough to confront Mark Sullivan directly, she received an email from an anonymous address. Its contents left her stunned. Grace, I know you're investigating, but there's something you need to hear. Curious, Grace opened the attached file. It was an audio recording of a conversation between Linda and an unidentified man. Linda's voice was shaky but unmistakable. I don't want to do this, but if I don't comply, I'll lose everything. The man replied coldly, if you don't cooperate, we'll make sure everything you have disappears, and not just yours, but your family's as well. Grace's heart sank. She realized that if she wanted to dismantle this corrupt system, she would have to face not just Mark but also the unsettling possibility of betrayal by those she once considered allies. Sophia, Grace said heavily, I need your help. We have to find a way to protect Linda before she does something irreversible. Meanwhile, Mark Sullivan, having learned that Grace was investigating him, shed his usual calm demeanor. At a clandestine meeting in a secluded cafe, Mark and Peter met to discuss their next steps. She can't go any further, Mark said, his eyes cold. Grace is getting too close to exposing everything. Peter clenched his fists, his anger evident. She humiliated me at the park, and now she's escalating things to the higher-ups. If we don't stop her, there's no way back for us. Mark raised an eyebrow, his tone lowering. Then we'll create something she can't fight back against. A few days later, Grace received an urgent summons from her superior for an emergency meeting. As she entered the room, she was met with a sea of eyes, no longer filled with respect but suspicion and coldness. On the table, a file was slid toward her. The department head spoke gravely. Grace, we've received reports alleging that you tampered with investigation records to dismiss complaints against certain officers. Grace froze. That's a baseless accusation, she said firmly. Who's making these claims? The department head didn't answer directly but pushed another set of documents toward her. Grace opened them to find forged emails, all under her name, instructing alterations to records and the deletion of critical evidence. We can't ignore this, the department head said. Until this matter is resolved, you are suspended from duty. Grace left the meeting, her mind reeling. Everything had unraveled so quickly. She realized she had walked straight into Mark and Peter's trap. They weren't just trying to stop her, they were attempting to destroy her reputation and career entirely. Back at home, Grace fought to remain calm as she combed through her files and emails, desperate to find a way to prove that the forged messages hadn't come from her. She called Detective Sophia Martinez, the colleague she trusted most. Sophia, I need your help, Grace said, her voice steady but weighted. What happened? Sophia asked. Grace explained everything, and Sophia immediately agreed to assist. Using her tech expertise and connections within the IT team, Sophia began analyzing the forged emails. After hours of work, she uncovered that the emails had been sent from an IP address outside the police department, one traced to the very cafe where Mark and Peter frequently met. They got too cocky, Sophia said. They didn't think we'd be able to trace this. Grace allowed herself a faint smile. We'll use their arrogance to bring them down. In a confidential meeting with the department head, Grace and Sophia presented the new evidence. Sophia projected details of the IP address and timestamps for the forged emails. The evidence conclusively implicated Mark and Peter in framing Grace. After carefully reviewing the findings, the department head's expression shifted from skepticism to anger. I won't let this be buried, he said. Mark Sullivan and Peter Rogers will face formal charges. Reinstated to her position, Grace wasted no time. She knew this was only the beginning. Mark and Peter still held influence, and if she didn't act swiftly, they would find another way to escape accountability. Now they know I won't go down easily, Grace told Sophia. But that also makes them more dangerous. We have to stay ahead. With Sophia and her loyal allies by her side, Grace prepared to push forward, this time with an unwavering resolve not just to clear her name but to bring the entire truth into the light. Grace listened to Sophia as she introduced the findings with precision and conviction, her voice carrying a weight that silenced even the skeptics. The room was tense, charged with a mix of disbelief, fear, and anger as each damning piece of evidence was displayed on the screen. Sophia started with the emails between Mark Sullivan and Richard Davenport. These communications show clear instructions for tampering with records, dismissing complaints, and manipulating evidence, she said, clicking to reveal the most incriminating excerpts. The room murmured in shock as each revelation unfolded. These aren't isolated incidents, Grace continued, stepping forward. This is a coordinated effort involving high-ranking officials. It's not just about misconduct, it's about a systemic abuse of power. She displayed the budget allocations next, revealing how public funds had been misappropriated to support the operations of the corrupt network. This document proves that Richard Davenport authorized the misuse of charity funds under the guise of community programs. These programs weren't helping the community, they were a front for hiding illegal activities. Mark's composure faltered slightly, his jaw tightening as whispers spread across the room. Beside him, Peter Rogers shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his usual bravado noticeably absent. Sophia clicked to the next slide, revealing the timeline of Nathan's attack. This isn't just about protecting their power. It's about silencing anyone who dares to challenge them. 2 days after Grace uncovered these files, her brother Nathan was assaulted and threatened, a clear act of intimidation. The police chief leaned forward, his brow furrowed. You're saying this network is willing to harm civilians to protect their secrets? Yes, Grace replied firmly. And that's exactly why we need to act. We can't allow this to continue. The tension in the room grew palpable as Grace and Sophia detailed how they had traced the forged emails to Mark's personal IP address. These forged emails were designed to frame me and discredit my investigation, Grace explained. But they made a critical mistake. They didn't cover their tracks. Sophia projected a map showing the location of the IP address, the cafe where Mark and Peter frequently met. This cafe is a hotspot for their secret meetings, she said. We also obtained surveillance footage from the area, confirming their presence there during the times these emails were sent. Mark stood abruptly, his voice cutting through the murmurs. This is outrageous. You have no concrete proof linking me to these actions. This is all circumstantial at best. Grace didn't flinch. Then explain this, she said, clicking to reveal a final email exchange between Mark and Peter, discussing the forged emails in chilling detail. The words were unmistakable, the intent clear. Mark's face turned pale, but before he could respond, the police chief raised a hand to silence him. Enough, Sullivan, he said. The evidence speaks for itself. As the meeting concluded, the police chief announced that Mark and Peter would be placed under immediate investigation, and Richard Davenport's involvement would be escalated to the state authorities. This department has no place for corruption, he said sternly. We'll ensure justice is served. Outside the meeting room, Grace and Sophia stood together, the weight of the moment settling in. We did it, Sophia said quietly, her voice tinged with both relief and exhaustion. It's not over yet, Grace replied, her gaze steely. They'll fight back harder than ever. But at least now, the truth is out. As they parted ways, Grace couldn't ignore the knot of unease in her stomach. The battle was far from won, but for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope. The system they were fighting was vast and powerful, but it wasn't invincible. And as long as she had allies like Sophia by her side, she knew they could dismantle it piece by piece. System of corruption extends far beyond Mark Sullivan and Peter Rogers. It implicates high-ranking officials, including those in positions of influence within the city government. These are not isolated incidents. This is a well-oiled machine designed to exploit public trust and resources for personal gain. Chief Caldwell opened the file, his expression growing more serious as he flipped through the pages. Inside were detailed reports of financial irregularities, emails between key players, and testimonies from whistleblowers who had been coerced into silence. Each piece of evidence was meticulously compiled, painting a damning picture of systemic corruption. Grace continued, her tone unwavering. This isn't just about misconduct or negligence. This is a deliberate effort to maintain control through manipulation, intimidation, and exploitation. The people responsible have built a fortress of lies, and it's time to tear it down. Caldwell leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled. These are serious allegations, Williams. If this evidence is as solid as it appears, we're looking at a scandal that could shake the entire department, and the city, to its core. That's exactly why it needs to come to light, Grace said. The longer we wait, the more damage they can do. We owe it to the community to act decisively. Caldwell nodded, his expression grim. I'll need time to review this. If it's as substantial as you claim, I'll authorize an independent task force to investigate further. But be prepared, Williams. If we proceed, this will be a fight like nothing you've faced before. Grace met his gaze, her resolve unshaken. I'm ready for whatever comes. The truth has to come out, no matter the cost. Over the next few weeks, the task force began its work, meticulously unraveling the threads of the corruption network. Each discovery led to another, revealing a web of deceit that spanned multiple departments and involved figures of significant influence. As the investigation gained momentum, the public began to take notice. News outlets picked up the story, and protests erupted across the city, demanding accountability and reform. Despite the growing pressure, Grace remained focused on the task at hand. She worked closely with the task force, providing additional evidence and coordinating with whistleblowers who were finally finding the courage to speak out. Every day brought new challenges, but also new victories. Slowly but surely, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Meanwhile, those implicated in the scandal grew increasingly desperate. Richard Davenport, one of the key architects of the corruption network, went into hiding, but not before attempting to destroy evidence that could link him to the crimes. His efforts were thwarted by Sophia, who had anticipated his moves and managed to secure critical documents before they could be erased. Sophia's tech expertise proved invaluable throughout the investigation. She tracked financial transactions, recovered deleted files, and even intercepted communications between key players. Her contributions were instrumental in building an airtight case against the perpetrators. As the evidence mounted, arrests were made. High-ranking officials, once untouchable, were taken into custody. Among them was Richard Davenport, who was apprehended in a dramatic raid that made headlines across the country. The public watched in awe as the once powerful figures were brought to justice, their crimes laid bare for all to see. But the fight was far from over. The corruption network was deeply entrenched, and dismantling it entirely would require sustained effort and vigilance. Grace knew that the battle for justice was an ongoing one, but she also knew that progress was being made. The walls of the fortress were beginning to crumble, and the light of truth was shining through. As the task force continued its work, Grace and Sophia took a moment to reflect on how far they had come. They had faced countless obstacles, from personal attacks to professional setbacks, but they had never wavered in their commitment to the cause. Together, they had exposed a system that had operated in the shadows for far too long, and they had given the community a reason to believe in justice once again. Grace stood at her office window, looking out over the city she had fought so hard to protect. The battle had taken its toll, but it had also strengthened her resolve. She knew there would be more challenges ahead, but she was ready to face them. With Sophia by her side and the support of a community that had rallied behind her, she was determined to see the fight through to the end. As the city began to rebuild its trust in the institutions that had failed them, Grace felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was not just about exposing corruption, it was about creating a system that truly served the people. It was about ensuring that no one else would have to endure what she and so many others had faced. It was about justice, resilience, and the unwavering belief that the truth would always prevail. The corruption within the department didn't stop with Mark Sullivan and Peter Rogers. Grace Williams uncovered a far-reaching network implicating high-ranking officials, including Richard Davenport, who orchestrated the cover-ups. Grace presented her findings to Police Chief Ethan Caldwell. This evidence shows a coordinated effort involving Sullivan, Davenport, and others to suppress complaints, falsify records, bribe witnesses, and misuse public funds, Grace explained, her voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. It's not just about individual misconduct, it's a deeply rooted system of corruption. Caldwell, initially skeptical, pored over the documents, recordings, and emails. His expression darkened as he absorbed the damning details. Williams, he said gravely, if this is true, it could shake the department to its core. I understand, sir, Grace replied. But if we ignore this, the department and the community we're sworn to protect will continue to suffer. After a long pause, Caldwell made a decision. He pressed the intercom button. Summon an emergency meeting with federal investigators. We'll hide nothing. This needs a full-scale investigation. Within 48 hours, a federal investigative team arrived, launching a thorough examination of the department. Offices were searched, files seized, and new evidence uncovered. When Richard Davenport was summoned for questioning, he initially denied involvement. But as proof of his participation in cover-ups and bribery piled up, his defenses crumbled. We did it to protect the department, Davenport stammered, his voice trembling. If every complaint surfaced, public trust would collapse. From the observation room, Grace remarked, they fail to see that it's their cover-ups that destroy trust. The investigation resulted in the suspension and criminal charges against Sullivan, Rogers, Davenport, and 3 other high-ranking officials. The charges ranged from abuse of power to document forgery and corruption. In a press conference, Caldwell addressed the public with a heavy heart. Our system has failed, but we will no longer conceal the truth. This is the first step toward rebuilding trust. That evening, Grace walked out of the precinct, her resolve unwavering. We've taken a big step, but this is far from over, she said to Sophia, who joined her outside. We did it, Grace, Sophia said, smiling. Grace nodded. Yes, but this is only one chapter in a much longer fight. The system needs change from the roots, and we can't stop now. Later that night, Grace returned home. The quiet of her house was a stark contrast to the storm she had faced earlier. As she set her briefcase down, her attention was drawn to a white envelope on the table. It bore no return address, only the words, for Grace Williams, scrawled in uneven handwriting. She froze, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of intrusion. Everything appeared untouched. Carefully, she opened the envelope. Inside was a single piece of paper with a chilling message. Don't think it's over. We're still here, and we won't forget. Grace's grip tightened on the note. Fear threatened to creep in, but it was quickly overtaken by her determination. The letter was a stark reminder that the corruption she fought against wasn't defeated. It was still out there, lurking in the shadows. The next morning, Sophia visited Grace after hearing about the letter. They're trying to scare you, Sophia said firmly. But it also proves we've hit them where it hurts. Grace nodded, her expression resolute. This network runs deeper than we imagined. Davenport and Sullivan were just the beginning. There are others higher up, and we need to expose them. Sophia's eyes mirrored Grace's determination. This isn't just about the department for me, Grace. It's personal. I'm fighting for my father's honor, for all the victims who were silenced. I won't stop, even if it makes me a target. Grace placed a reassuring hand on Sophia's shoulder. You're not alone in this fight. We'll see this through together. That evening, Grace pored over the remaining files. Among them were hundreds of complaints, voices of the unheard, each one a plea for justice. She realized their work had only scratched the surface of the systemic corruption. She turned to Sophia, who was reviewing documents beside her. This isn't just a fight against individuals, Grace said. It's against a system that's allowed this to happen. If we stop now, everything will go back to the way it was. Then we won't stop, Sophia replied. We'll keep pushing until there's nothing left for them to hide behind. Grace drafted a letter to her team, expressing her gratitude and rallying them for the challenges ahead. We've proven that truth can prevail, she wrote. But this is not the end. There are countless injustices still to uncover, and we must be ready for the battles ahead. As the city lights glimmered outside her window, Grace stood in quiet reflection. The battle she had fought had taken its toll, but it also reaffirmed her belief in the power of truth and justice. She vowed silently, they may hide in the shadows, but I'll make sure the light finds them. The truth will always find a way. The next day, Grace and Sophia met with federal investigators to discuss the next phase of their mission. They shared their strategy for uncovering the remaining layers of corruption, knowing that the stakes were higher than ever. The battle was no longer just about justice for the victims, it was about restoring faith in a system that had betrayed the people it was meant to serve. As they left the meeting, Sophia looked at Grace with a small smile. Do you ever think we'll see the end of this? Grace's gaze was steady. I don't know if we'll see the end, but I know we're making it harder for them to continue. Every truth we uncover is a step closer to a better system. That night, Grace received another anonymous message. This time, it read, You may have won this round, but the game isn't over. She smirked, folding the note and placing it in her desk. Let them come, she said to herself. I'll be ready.